Hi, it's Lou Collins. Today I want to look at the new Adventures in Ink gathered stamp set. Now this is a new brand to CraftStash. Absolutely beautiful, lots of different designs to choose from. So the gathered is all about floral stems and I wanted to work with them, but I'm going to focus around one of the sentiments here. So I'm placing my sentiment onto watercolour cardstock. I'm working out where this is first and putting a pencil line just very, very lightly around where I want that to be, because I want to make sure that I don't stamp or add any ink underneath that, so the sentiment's nice and clear later on. So what I tend to do is I pop my stamps back on the top of my stamp set while I'm working with it and put everything away properly underneath later. So just protecting my surface with one of CraftStash's clear blending mats there. And then I've chosen this stem. It's more foliage than flowers, but it's going to look really beautiful in blues and greens. So I'm taking Distress Oxide in Uncharted Mariner, and then the green, I think it was a peeled paint, beautiful colours together. Just smooching some onto my blending mat and then spritzing a bit of water, about 4 or 5 spritzes of water for each one. Now I'm using an acrylic block for this rather than a stamping platform because I need to change direction so much. Picking up that watered down ink with my stamp and just gently pressing it into the watercolour cardstock, but making sure I'm avoiding that pencil line that I've drawn on there. So each time I stamp a stem, I'm going to hold the ink onto the watercolour cardstock just for a few seconds longer than you usually would when you're stamping, just to allow the paper to start absorbing. Now you're not going to be looking at a perfect image with this sort of stamping technique. You're going to be getting different sort of blur lines. Some's going to be really defined detail and some isn't, and it's just a really nice watercolour effect. So then I just started picking up different parts of green and blue. Some of my stems were more blue, some were more green, some were a mix. As I worked through, I started to get sort of muddied colour, so I made sure in the beginning I stamped all around the card first, so I got that sort of variation of the blues and greens before it started going too muddy. So once I'd stamped everywhere I wanted to, I just picked up a bit of ink with my black paintbrush and did some splats as well, again avoiding that area where my sentiment was going to go. To frame this card, I took the same 2 Distress Oxides and I blended around the ink using my CraftStash blending brushes. So starting with the green and going in about a centimetre or so from each edge. Now you can see I'm on one of the smaller clear blending mats that comes in the pack with the A4 one as well. So I went round with the green and then I went with the dark blue that we'd used as well afterwards, and I just framed the outside, but this time I just went round the very, very edges with the Uncharted Mariner, and that just really sort of gave it a bit of a vignette look, so a nice dark shadow around the outside. So this time I didn't go quite so far in. I was sort of angled my brush so I could just capture the very, very edge of the card, and you can already see there what a difference it makes. But you do need to make sure your watercolour, your stamping is absolutely dry before you do this, otherwise you're just going to be smearing it and smudging it everywhere. And we're really starting to get a really sort of vintage stamped look to the card background. And bear in mind, this is all just on watercolour cardstock. You can use sort of stamping card, but I find the water and the ink hold better on watercolour instead. And CraftStash do a lovely pack of white watercolour card as well. So then I took my sentiment again, and first of all I needed to erase that pencil line. Don't forget, again, make sure all your ink is dry before you do this, or you'll just end up with lots of smudges. So reposition that stamp back where you want it. Now this is where you can use a stamping platform if you wish. I just had my acrylic block to hand, so I used that. But yeah, use your stamping platform if you want more accurate stamping here. You're not going to be moving it about, so if you want to, you can then do a couple of impressions if you want a really dark ink instead. So I was going to use embossing ink by accident, but I am going to be using VersaFine for this, or VersaFine Clair for this, for a nice black detailed stamp, especially on the watercolour cardstock, because there's a bit of texture to it. I wanted to make sure I had a nice solid detailed ink that was going to capture every element of each of the letters there. So just stamping that there. Hope you get spoiled rotten. Looks really lovely with that sort of frame around the wording, so the wording doesn't get lost amongst the background. So then I needed to make a card base for this, and I'm really into having solid cardstock or coloured card bases rather than white. So what I tend to do is take my Creative Craft Products trimmer and I do my score line where I need to using the white blade. I fold my card. I've already pre-measured where my score line would need to be, and then I just put my mat onto my card, use that as a guide, and I trim the two edges, and it's as easy as that to get myself a custom made coloured cardstock card base. So for this one I'm going to put the white scoring blade up out the way and then press down with the cutting blade just to trim that down to where I need it to be, and then of course I just spin that round and then I cut the base as well. If you want to, you can leave yourself a bit at the base for an extra sentiment strip or panel or some gems or something like this. So like I say, custom card base is perfect here. I usually open my card base up when I'm doing this cut along here horizontally because it's just easier than going through 2 layers of cardstock. You do get a cleaner cut, but it's not really an option as easily when you're doing a vertical cut. So there we go. All I need to do now is just glue that watercolour panel onto my card base. Any wet glue is fine for this. If you want to use double-sided tape, you can. If you want to use even foam tape, if you want to give it some dimension, but of course be wary if you are posting this. Think about your postage prices and the thickness of it. So just got a little bit of a border, and the border should echo that inking that you've done around the edge, so that's where that dark blue then leads into the card base. So there we have it, one finished watercolour effect card, really beautiful, quite vintage in style, and it's just been made beautifully with the Adventures in Ink brand new brand from CraftStash.